Blake Connolly's marriage to Vanessa had always been built on mutual respect, shared goals, and, though he'd never admit it aloud, a certain convenience. They'd met through friends in their late 20s when they were both tired of the dating scene, each seeking someone dependable, someone who could help them create a picture-perfect life. And they had achieved just that, a cozy home, a family-owned cafe that thrived in the community, and two bright-eyed children, Ellie and Noah. On the surface, their life was everything they'd imagined, but under the facade, a quiet desperation simmered, one Blake only began to feel in recent months. One frosty morning, Blake sat alone in the cafe, sipping his coffee. It was the rare morning he opened the shop himself. Usually, it was Vanessa's domain. She had insisted on handling the day-to-day, claiming it allowed her more time with the children. But lately, she'd been spending less and less time with them. Or him, for that matter. She was always off on last-minute showings, tied up with urgent client calls that seemed to pull her away at the oddest hours. Last week, she'd missed Ellie's first science fair competition, and Blake had found himself standing alone in the crowd of parents, clapping and waving at Ellie's small, searching face. The door chime broke his reverie. Brenda, his sister and co-owner, entered with her usual bright smile, but it faltered as she saw Blake's expression. "Everything okay, little brother?" she asked, a hint of concern lacing her tone. Blake forced a smile. "Yeah, just a slow morning. Needed the time to clear my head." But Brenda wasn't fooled. She never was. "Clearing your head or worrying about Vanessa?" she asked, raising a brow as she filled a cup of coffee. "I swear, you've looked 10 years older this past month. Something's eating at you. Spill it." Blake hesitated. Vanessa's behavior was personal, something he hadn't yet dared to examine too closely himself, let alone talk about. "It's nothing. Just, she's been working a lot. Seems like she's barely home lately." Brenda sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "Doesn't sound like the Vanessa I know. Didn't she always hate working weekends?" He nodded slowly, an uneasy feeling gnawing at him. "Yeah, that's what I thought." Later that evening, as Blake and Vanessa sat across from each other at the dinner table, a silence fell between them that felt as thick as smoke. Vanessa had been glued to her phone all evening, barely picking at her food, texting so intently that her fork clinked untouched against the edge of her plate. Blake's patience was wearing thin. "Big client meeting tomorrow?" he asked, trying to keep his tone casual. She looked up, startled, and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "Hmm? Oh, yes. Early morning. A new listing. High-end property." Blake forced a smile. "Do I know the client?" Vanessa's gaze flicked back to her phone. "Oh, just someone Brenda knows from the cafe." Something in her response rang false. Blake knew Brenda's regulars. He'd seen them all at the cafe over the years, and none of them seemed like the high-end property type. A strange feeling crept into his mind, a whisper of doubt he couldn't shake. But he brushed it off. After all, they were married, and marriage meant trust. Or so he told himself as he cleared the plates, Vanessa already gone, claiming a late-night call she needed to take in her office. Days turned into weeks, and Vanessa's behavior grew more erratic. One evening, she returned home far later than expected, smelling faintly of cologne. Blake didn't recognize. When he asked about it, she laughed, saying it must have been from an overly friendly client who'd leaned in too close. But the laugh felt hollow, and her explanation rang even hollower. One Saturday morning, Blake stood in the living room, observing Vanessa as she prepared to leave for yet another client meeting. The kids had begged for her to stay, Noah pulling at her coat, Ellie with tears in her eyes, pleading for a family day at the park. Vanessa peeled them off with a distracted smile, promising that they'd do something fun soon. But when Blake stepped close to her to kiss her goodbye, she turned her face, her eyes distant, lips cold against his cheek. As he watched her pull away in her car, something within him hardened. The life they'd built suddenly felt like a brittle glass sculpture, one that could shatter with the slightest touch. Blake's mind spun with thoughts he didn't want to admit. Was this the price of their perfect life? Was this all a facade he'd been too willing to believe in? Determined to keep their life from collapsing, he began to keep a closer watch, noticing things he'd previously ignored, the long hours, the mystery clients, the faint smudges of cologne that didn't belong to him. The following week, Blake found himself lingering outside her office, where her meetings took place. He spotted her laughing with a man he'd never seen before, the two of them leaning in close, a familiarity between them that made his blood run cold. Marriage of convenience, she'd once joked on their wedding day. Blake had laughed then, shrugging it off, but now he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, all along, Vanessa had been living by those words more than he ever realized. And for the first time, he began to see his marriage and his wife in a new and terrifying light. Blake sat alone in his workshop, the scent of motor oil and metal filling the air as he wiped grease from his hands. He needed the solitude, the familiar hum of the tools, anything to quiet the restlessness that had taken root in his chest. Ever since that morning outside Vanessa's office, he'd been plagued with images of her, laughing with that stranger, the soft touch of her hand on his arm, the way her face had lit up in a way that felt foreign and painful. A knock on the workshop door broke his thoughts. He looked up to find his buddy Mike leaning against the doorframe, a knowing look in his eyes. "Working late, huh? Brenda mentioned you've been a little preoccupied," Mike said, folding his arms. Blake hesitated before speaking, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Vanessa's been acting strange, going out a lot, meeting people," he finally admitted, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. Mike let out a low whistle, looking concerned. "You're telling me you think Vanessa's cheating?" The question hung in the air, thick and tangible. Blake stared at his friend, a swirl of doubt and anger churning in his gut. "I don't know," he said quietly, the uncertainty gnawing at him. "But something's off." Mike clapped a hand on his shoulder, offering him a mix of sympathy and strength. "Listen, man, if you need to get answers, you'll have to get real about this. Sitting here, wondering and hoping, it's just going to eat you up." The following day, Blake found himself standing outside the office of Hank Morrison, a private investigator recommended by a mutual friend. Hank's office was a stark contrast to Blake's workshop. Dimly lit, cluttered with stacks of manila folders, a faint smell of stale coffee lingering in the air. Hank, a gruff man with steel gray eyes and a no-nonsense expression, leaned back in his chair as Blake explained the situation. "So," Hank began, his gaze steady, "you're saying she's been disappearing without much explanation?" Blake nodded, feeling exposed just by saying the words out loud. "I just need to know, whatever the answer is." Hank's eyes softened, and he nodded in understanding. "Trust me, I get it. Now, I don't usually suggest this first thing, but if you really want to know what's going on, surveillance is the best way." A week later, the photos arrived. Blake tore open the envelope, his hands trembling as he sifted through images of Vanessa with the same man, Curtis Blackwood. In each photo, the familiarity between them was undeniable. Laughing over dinner, their hands brushing as they walked side by side. In one shot, they were leaning close, Curtis's hand resting on Vanessa's arm, her face lit with the same smile Blake had once thought was reserved only for him. The worst photo lay at the bottom of the stack. Vanessa and Curtis in the dim lighting of a downtown bar, his hand on her lower back, her gaze locked on his with an intensity that spoke of secrets, desires Blake hadn't seen in her eyes for years. The image burned into his mind, a searing confirmation of everything he'd feared. The walls seemed to close in around him as he dropped the photos onto the table. His heart raced, a mixture of hurt and fury that had been simmering for too long. He'd devoted himself to their family, to building a life he'd thought they both wanted, yet here she was, living a double life right under his nose. Blake's hand shook as he dialed her number, his voice tense as he heard the familiar ring on the other end. Vanessa's voice answered, smooth and familiar, but to him it now sounded sharp and hollow. "Hey," she answered, a little too casually. "Is everything all right?" He struggled to keep his voice steady. "Can we talk tonight? Just us. I'll make dinner." There was a slight pause on her end, almost as if she were weighing her options. Finally, she agreed. "Of course. I'll be home at 7. As Blake prepared the meal that night, his mind ran through everything he wanted to say, every accusation he wanted to throw in her face. But when Vanessa finally walked through the door, he felt his resolve waver. She looked like the woman he'd loved for years, the mother of his children, and he wondered how he'd ever missed the signs. They ate in silence, her gaze flickering over him as if she sensed something different in the air. After dinner, Blake took a deep breath and slid the envelope across the table. Vanessa's eyes widened as she saw the photos, her face draining of color as she flipped through them, her hands shaking. "I know, Vanessa," Blake said, his voice low. "I know about Curtis." She didn't respond immediately, her hands frozen over the photos. When she finally looked up, her eyes were filled with guilt and a hint of something else, defiance. "What do you want me to say?" she whispered, her voice tight. "I'm sorry." "Sorry." Blake's voice broke, raw and full of hurt. "That's it." Vanessa set the photos down, a strange calm settling over her. "You were always so focused on the cafe, on the kids, on being the perfect husband and father. I needed something more." "Something more?" Blake's fists clenched, anger flaring in his chest. "Is this how you justify it? Sneaking around behind my back? Lying to our kids?" She met his gaze, her face unreadable. "Maybe this marriage was just convenient for you, Blake. But for me, I wanted something real." The words stung, cutting deep. For a moment, he felt like he was standing in front of a stranger. And as she looked back at him, a quiet, steely resolve began to form in his mind. "That's fine," he said finally, his voice cold and distant. "If this marriage is just convenience, then maybe it's time we put an end to it." He could see a flicker of surprise in her eyes, but he didn't wait to hear her response. Turning on his heel, he left her sitting alone with the evidence of her betrayal, a bitter sense of determination driving him forward. If she wanted out, he'd give her what she asked for, but not before showing her what real consequences looked like. Blake's mind raced as he left Vanessa alone in the kitchen, her betrayal ringing in his ears. He needed air, space to think without her presence filling the room. He drove aimlessly through the quiet streets, the city lights blurring around him as he replayed her words in his mind. Something more wanted something real. Each phrase cut him deeper, leaving a bitterness he could barely contain. After an hour of circling the neighborhood, he found himself parked outside his sister Brenda's house. He hadn't planned to come here, but it felt like the only place that could ground him. Brenda opened the door, her face softening as she saw his expression. Without a word, she pulled him inside, guiding him to the couch and pouring him a glass of bourbon. "Tell me everything," she said quietly, her tone edged with fury that mirrored his own. Blake took a long sip, the liquid burning his throat but offering little comfort. He handed her the envelope of photos, watching her face as she flipped through them, her eyes hardening with each image. When she finished, she looked up, a steely determination in her gaze. "You can't let her get away with this, Blake," she said firmly. "She's not just betraying you. She's risking everything you've built for the kids, for your life together. She deserves to feel the weight of what she's done." Blake nodded, a plan already taking shape in his mind. He would give Vanessa what she wanted, a separation, but not before setting the terms to his advantage. He wasn't about to let her walk away unscathed, not when she'd shattered everything he'd worked so hard to build. The next morning, he called Hank Morrison, the private investigator who had provided the evidence of her affair. This time, however, he didn't want more photos. He wanted leverage. Blake needed proof that would ensure he kept full custody of Ellie and Noah, that Vanessa's new life would be shadowed by the consequences of her actions. Hank, sensing Blake's resolve, agreed to dig deeper into Vanessa's life, her finances, and, most importantly, her dealings with Curtis Blackwood. Days passed, and Blake played his role flawlessly. He became the dutiful husband Vanessa had always expected, smiling when he handed her coffee in the mornings, nodding as she went on about her busy work schedule. Each day she left, he remained calm, counting down until Hank would have the final pieces of information he needed. One evening, Hank called with a breakthrough. Vanessa had been siphoning money from their joint account, covering up her tracks by labeling it as business expenses. But it wasn't going into the family or the cafe. It was being funneled into a private account under her name. Worse, Curtis was involved in something much darker. He'd been using his real estate connections to engage in fraudulent deals, pocketing large sums from unsuspecting clients who believed in his fabricated listings. Armed with the new information, Blake felt his sense of purpose sharpen. He called Vanessa, who answered with a tone of forced cheeriness, as if the affair had never been discovered. "Can you meet me at the cafe after hours?" he asked smoothly. "I think we should discuss our future." She hesitated, as though sensing a shift in his tone, but agreed. That night, Blake waited for her in the dim lighting of the cafe, a place that had once been the cornerstone of their marriage and dreams. She walked in, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, a wary smile on her face. "Blake," she began, her voice soft as if testing the waters. "I know things have been tense lately, and I'm sorry if I made you feel—" "Save it," Blake interrupted, the ice in his voice cutting through her rehearsed apology. "I'm not here to listen to excuses. I'm here to tell you how things are going to work from now on." Vanessa's expression shifted, her eyes narrowing as she folded her arms across her chest. "Is that so?" she asked, her tone challenging. "Since when do you get to call all the shots?" Blake pulled out the envelope Hank had given him, dropping it on the table between them. "Since you decided to take our money and run off with a man who's more interested in your bank account than your so-called charm. Open it." She glared at him, but her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the envelope. Inside were bank statements showing her secret account, along with photos of Curtis accepting payments from dubious clients. Her face paled as she realized the gravity of the evidence. "Blake, you thought you could just walk away, didn't you?" He interrupted, his voice calm but deadly. "Leave me and the kids behind while you play house with a man who's nothing more than a glorified con artist? I've been nothing but loyal to you, Vanessa, and this is how you repay me?" She tried to regain her composure, straightening her shoulders. "So what? You're going to throw this in my face? Take me to court?" Blake leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "That's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm filing for divorce, and I'll be asking for full custody of Ellie and Noah. I have more than enough proof that you're unfit, financially, emotionally, and morally. You're not taking them from me." For the first time, real fear crossed her face. "Blake, please, we can work this out. I made a mistake, but the kids, they need their mother." He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Did you think of them while you were sneaking around? Did you think of them when you lied to my face? No, Vanessa, you don't get to play the victim here. This was your choice, and now you'll live with it." She opened her mouth to protest, but the words died on her lips. He could see the desperation in her eyes, the realization that her carefully crafted escape plan was crumbling around her. "Blake," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm sorry. I don't want to lose my family." But Blake's heart had turned to stone. The woman before him wasn't his wife. She was a stranger who'd traded her family for fleeting excitement and lies. He stood, gathering the evidence and turning toward the door. "You already did," he said coldly, leaving her alone in the shadows of the empty cafe. As he stepped outside, the weight of finality settled over him, and yet he felt lighter, as though he had finally broken free. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but he knew it was one he had to take, no matter the cost. Blake drove through the rain-soaked streets, a storm brewing inside him that matched the darkened skies. Vanessa's betrayal, her hollow pleas, all rang in his ears like an endless echo. He had ended it, made his stance clear, yet a gnawing feeling told him this battle was far from over. She wouldn't go quietly. He could see that determination in her eyes, a flicker of resentment that warned him she would fight for what she thought she deserved. Blake needed more than just proof of her affair to secure his family's future. He needed someone on the inside, someone who could give him the edge. 2 days later, he got his chance when he received a call from a blocked number. On the other end was Marissa Blackwood, Curtis's wife, her voice steely but laced with tension. "Blake Connolly?" she asked, her voice unwavering. "I believe we have something in common, a cheating spouse. And I have a feeling you're as tired of being a bystander in their games as I am." They arranged to meet at a quiet bar just outside town, a dimly lit place that felt more like a refuge for the brokenhearted than a spot for casual drinks. Marissa arrived first, a striking woman with sharp eyes and a sense of purpose that Blake admired instantly. She looked as though she hadn't slept in days, but there was a resilience to her, a glint of determination that told him she was as committed to exposing the truth as he was. "Blake," she greeted him, extending her hand. "Thank you for meeting me." He nodded, settling across from her. "You said you wanted to talk about Curtis?" She leaned forward, her gaze intense. "Yes, Curtis and Vanessa. I know they're more than just business partners. I've seen the messages, overheard his calls, But it's more than that. She paused, lowering her voice. Curtis isn't just cheating on me. He's been using his position to siphon money from his clients, including me. He's got our accounts tangled in his scheme. And Vanessa, well, I wouldn't be surprised if she's in on it too. Blake's jaw tightened as he took in her words. That doesn't surprise me. I found out Vanessa's been funneling money from our joint account to cover her tracks. But if Curtis is as deep in this as you say, then they're both in trouble, and we're the ones who can bring them down. Marissa's eyes gleamed. Exactly. And I have access to Curtis's business records, hidden away in his home office. They're encrypted, but if I can get to them, we'll have proof of the fraud and enough leverage to make sure Vanessa and Curtis pay for everything they've done. They spent hours strategizing, poring over each detail, formulating a plan that would dismantle Curtis and Vanessa's web of lies piece by piece. Marissa would retrieve the files from Curtis's computer while he was at a late-night business dinner Vanessa had scheduled. In the meantime, Blake would set up a meeting with his lawyer to outline the divorce proceedings and secure his custody of Ellie and Noah, using the evidence he'd gathered. As Marissa and Blake left the bar, they paused under the street lamp, the cold night air sharp against their skin. She glanced up at him, a slight smirk breaking her otherwise serious expression. You know, if someone had told me a year ago I'd be working with my husband's mistress's husband to bring them down, I would have laughed them out of the room. Blake managed a dry chuckle. Guess betrayal has a funny way of creating unexpected alliances. They parted ways with a plan in place, their resolve strengthened by the knowledge that they were no longer alone in this fight. The next evening, Marissa arrived at Curtis's home, her heart pounding as she let herself in with the spare key she'd managed to hide from him. She knew his schedule well enough to know he wouldn't be back for hours, but the risk still set her nerves on edge. The office was dark, the only light coming from a small lamp on the desk. She sat down at Curtis's computer, her hands moving deftly across the keyboard as she accessed his files. Her heart racing each time she discovered a new hidden document. The numbers were damning. Real estate clients charged double, shell accounts in Vanessa's name, and transactions that linked to high-end luxuries she'd never seen in their home. Just as she finished transferring the files onto a USB drive, she heard the unmistakable sound of Curtis's car pulling into the driveway. Her blood turned to ice. He was supposed to be gone for hours, and if he found her here, the consequences could be disastrous. Without a second thought, Marissa shut down the computer, stuffing the USB into her bag, and slipped out through the back door just as Curtis entered the front, oblivious to her presence. Breathless and exhilarated, Marissa called Blake as soon as she reached her car. "I got it," she said, her voice triumphant. "Everything we need. Transactions, hidden accounts. He's finished." Blake's relief was palpable on the other end of the line. Then it's time to put the final pieces together. They met again the next day, this time in Blake's lawyer's office. Angela Martinez, a fierce attorney with a reputation for ruthless strategy, reviewed the documents with a satisfied smile. "This is more than enough," she said, closing the file. "Not only can we ensure that Vanessa won't get a cent, but we can bring Curtis down in the process." They filed the papers that day, officially setting the divorce in motion. Blake made sure to keep everything under wraps until the right moment, wanting Vanessa and Curtis to remain in the dark until the final blow struck. Days passed, and Blake went about his life as usual, playing the role of a husband worn down by guilt and trust issues, a man desperate to hold his marriage together. Then, on a Friday evening, Blake arranged to meet Vanessa and Curtis for a family meeting under the guise of working things out. As they sat across from him, Vanessa looked impatient, Curtis smug as ever, but Blake felt no anger, only a cold determination. "I wanted to give you both a chance," he began, keeping his tone neutral. "A chance to admit to everything you've done and walk away peacefully. But I see that was wishful thinking." Curtis laughed, a derisive sound. "You're bluffing, Connolly. You don't have any idea what's been going on, do you?" Blake's expression didn't waver. Instead, he reached into his bag, pulling out the folder of evidence Marissa had retrieved. He watched as Curtis's smirk faded, replaced by a look of pure shock. Vanessa's face paled as she saw the numbers, the transactions, the extent of their deception laid bare before them. "You're both finished," Blake said, his voice hard. "Every single lie, every cent you stole, every underhanded deal, it's all here. And now I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly who you are." Curtis's bravado crumbled, his eyes darting to Vanessa, who looked equally cornered. "Blake, please," she began, her voice trembling. "We can work this out. Think of the kids." He shook his head, his resolve unbreakable. "The kids are the only reason I'm doing this, Vanessa. You might have fooled me once, but that's over. You've both made your choices. Now you'll live with the consequences." As he turned and walked out, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He could almost taste the freedom, the satisfaction of knowing he'd left them with nothing but the ruin they'd created. Outside, he met Marissa, who waited in the shadows, watching as Curtis and Vanessa stumbled out after him, both visibly shaken. Marissa gave Blake a nod, her own sense of victory matching his. Together, they walked away from the scene, knowing they had reclaimed the lives that Vanessa and Curtis had so recklessly tried to destroy. The sun barely peeked over the horizon when Blake stepped into the courthouse, his mind sharpened with a resolve he hadn't felt in years. Today was the day he would fight for his children, Ellie and Noah, the only piece of his life he could still protect from Vanessa's betrayal. Across the courtroom, Vanessa sat next to her lawyer, a sleek woman with a glint of ambition in her eyes. Vanessa's face was cold, her usual confidence now replaced with a hardened, defensive stance as she glanced at him. Angela Martinez, Blake's formidable attorney, leaned close, her voice low and calm. "This is the final play, Blake. With the evidence we've gathered on her affair, her financial duplicity, and Curtis's criminal activities, we've got a solid case for full custody. Stick to the facts, show them you're the stable parent, and don't let her rattle you." Blake nodded, inhaling deeply as he glanced back to where Brenda sat in the gallery. She gave him a supportive nod, her expression fierce. Blake drew strength from her presence, feeling the familiar warmth of family loyalty bolster him. The hearing began, and Vanessa's lawyer wasted no time trying to paint her as a mother trapped in a loveless marriage who had been forced to seek connection elsewhere. Vanessa herself sat, gazing downcast, every bit the sympathetic figure, her hands folded in her lap as if she were the victim. But Blake remained unfazed, meeting each accusation with a calm, straightforward retelling of the events. When Angela rose to present his side, she spoke with precision, detailing every instance of Vanessa's deception, from the financial statements showing her private account to the records of her affair with Curtis. Then came the bombshell. Angela presented evidence of Curtis's embezzlement and the transactions linked directly to Vanessa's account, connecting her to the criminal charges that had been filed against Curtis. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, and for the first time, Vanessa's carefully composed mask cracked. Her lawyer scrambled to salvage the situation, but the damage was done. The courtroom was buzzing with the realization that Vanessa had not only betrayed her husband, but had placed their children's future at risk for her personal gain. Blake watched her reaction with a grim satisfaction, though he knew this was only the beginning. He needed the judge to see the truth, to understand the depths of her deceit and what it meant for Ellie and Noah. When Blake took the stand, Angela prompted him to speak about his relationship with his children. His voice softened as he described the family moments, from early morning breakfasts to helping Ellie with her science projects and coaching Noah's Little League team. He spoke with sincerity, his love for his children palpable in each word. He looked directly at the judge, his voice steady but edged with vulnerability. "They mean everything to me," he said simply. "And after everything that's happened, I want to be the one to make sure they're safe, loved, and protected. I've built my life around them, and I will do anything to give them the stability they deserve." The judge nodded thoughtfully, taking in Blake's testimony, but the moment of truth came when Vanessa herself was called to the stand. As she took her seat, Blake could see the tremor in her hands, the telltale signs of a woman cornered. Vanessa's lawyer tried to direct her responses, guiding her with leading questions, but Vanessa's temper began to fray. Under cross-examination, Angela expertly pressed her on every uncomfortable detail, her affair with Curtis, her secret account, and her knowledge of Curtis's fraudulent dealings. "Mrs. Connolly," Angela began, her tone sharp. "Would you say that you have consistently acted in your children's best interests?" Vanessa's voice wavered as she answered, "Of course, I did what I thought was best for me and for the family." Angela leaned forward, her gaze unyielding. "So, did you consider how your affair with Mr. Connick Blackwood would impact your children's stability? Or how siphoning money from the joint account would affect their future?" Vanessa clenched her jaw, her voice rising as she finally snapped. "Blake was never there. He was obsessed with the cafe, with keeping everything perfect. I needed more than just being the mother. Is that so wrong?" Angela's face remained impassive as she continued. "So, in your pursuit of this more, you exposed your children to a man now facing criminal charges, drained money from their future, and jeopardized their stability. Is that right?" Vanessa's face flushed, and she glanced desperately at the judge, her expression a mixture of guilt and anger. She looked like a woman cornered, her mask slipping as she realized the gravity of her actions. Blake watched, feeling an odd sense of liberation as her facade crumbled in front of everyone. When the time came for the judge's ruling, the courtroom fell silent. The judge cleared her throat, her expression serious as she delivered the verdict. "Given the evidence presented today," she began, "it is clear that Mrs. Connolly has displayed a pattern of behavior that raises serious concerns about her ability to provide a stable environment for her children. The financial records, her involvement with a man engaged in criminal activity, and her disregard for the family's welfare all point to a lapse in judgment that cannot be ignored." Blake held his breath as she continued, every word carrying the weight of a lifetime. "Therefore, I am awarding Mr. Connolly full custody of Ellie and Noah. Mrs. Connolly will retain supervised visitation rights, which may be revisited pending a review in 6 months' time." The gavel struck, and Blake felt a surge of relief wash over him. It was over, at least for now. He had won, and his children would be with him, safe and secure. But as he left the courthouse, Vanessa's eyes followed him, a glint of fury still flickering within them. She wasn't done fighting, he could tell, and she would likely try to worm her way back into their lives by any means possible. Outside, Brenda embraced him, her eyes filled with pride and relief. "You did it, Blake," she whispered. "They'll be safe with you." He nodded, his gaze lingering on the courthouse steps where Vanessa stood, her expression unreadable. She seemed smaller, defeated, yet Blake knew better than to let his guard down. Later that evening, as he tucked Ellie and Noah into bed, he watched them sleep, feeling the weight of all that had transpired settle over him. The battle might be over, but a new chapter was just beginning. A chapter where he would rebuild, not just for himself, but for the children who now depended on him more than ever. As he closed their bedroom door, his phone buzzed, a text from Marissa. "We did it. They're both finished. Coffee tomorrow?" Blake smiled, feeling an unexpected sense of hope. Vanessa's betrayal had broken him in ways he couldn't yet understand, but this victory, hard-won as it was, meant he could finally start to heal. He replied, "Coffee sounds good." And for the first time in a long time, Blake felt like the future might hold something worth looking forward to. Chapter 6, Rebuilding and New Beginnings. Months had passed since the custody hearing, and Blake was slowly settling into his new life as a single father. The sting of betrayal lingered, but each day it grew fainter, replaced by a newfound sense of freedom and purpose. Ellie and Noah were thriving, smiling more, laughing more, and he was finally able to be there for them in the way he'd always wanted. There were mornings they'd rush into the cafe before school, the moi giggling as they helped Brenda fill coffee cups, making the place feel like a true family business again. One chilly autumn afternoon, as Blake locked up the cafe, he heard a familiar voice behind him. He turned to find Marissa standing in the fading sunlight, her hands tucked into the pockets of her coat, a slight smile on her face. "Hey," she greeted, stepping forward. "Got time for that coffee?" Blake nodded, smiling as he held the door open for her. They settled into a corner booth, and for the first time, Blake felt entirely relaxed. Marissa had been a godsend through everything, a fierce and steady presence who understood exactly what he'd been through. She was the one person who knew the whole story, the one who'd stood by him when things seemed impossible. As they sipped their coffee, Marissa shared updates on her own life. She had filed for divorce from Curtis and managed to regain control over her finances. The courts had taken swift action, and Curtis was now awaiting trial for embezzlement. Her laughter was lighter now, unburdened, and Blake realized she, too, was finally free. "It's strange, isn't it?" Marissa mused, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. "How one betrayal can destroy everything. And yet here we are, rebuilding from the rubble." Blake nodded, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Who would have thought that our greatest heartbreak would lead to this?" She looked up at him, her gaze warm. "This?" she echoed, her voice playful. Blake felt a warmth rise in his chest, an unfamiliar feeling he hadn't expected. Over the months of plotting revenge and enduring court battles, he and Marissa had become close, their connection forged in the fires of betrayal. He wasn't ready to admit it just yet, but there was something deeper there, something he hadn't felt in years. As the conversation continued, Marissa mentioned that she'd begun volunteering at a local organization for victims of financial abuse, helping others who had suffered similar betrayals. She invited Blake to join her the following weekend, and without hesitation, he agreed. He found himself wanting to spend more time with her, to explore what lay beyond the chaos they had left behind. The weeks passed in a blur, and soon Blake's life had found a new rhythm. He'd spend mornings in the cafe, less on afternoons with the kids, and some evenings, after the children were asleep, he'd find himself texting Marissa or meeting her for quiet dinners where they would laugh, reminisce, and dream of a future free from their pasts. She became his confidant, his partner in a world that finally made sense. But just as Blake felt he was moving forward, a shadow from the past resurfaced. One evening, as he was closing up the cafe, he found Vanessa waiting outside, her face pale in the dim light. He stiffened, his mind racing with questions. They hadn't spoken outside of custody exchanges, and he preferred it that way. Yet here she was, her expression conflicted, as if she were on the brink of saying something important. "Blake," she began, her voice strained. I need your help." He stared at her, unsure of how to respond. "Help?" he repeated, wary. She nodded, glancing around as if someone might be listening. "Curtis, he's dragging me down with him. The trial is starting soon, and his lawyers are trying to shift the blame onto me. He claims I knew everything, that I was involved in every shady deal he made." Blake felt a flash of anger, his patience wearing thin. "And why should I care, Vanessa? You got yourself into this. You thought he was your something more, remember?" Her face crumpled, a desperate look in her eyes. "I know I made mistakes, Blake. But if this goes wrong, I could lose everything. I'll be ruined. I'm begging you, for the sake of our children, just testify that I didn't know about the financial stuff. Please." He studied her, weighing her words. Part of him wanted to walk away, to let her sink in the mess she'd created. But then he thought of Ellie and Noah, and he knew he had to set an example. With a deep sigh, he replied, "I'll consider it, Vanessa, but I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for the kids." Relief flooded her face, but he stopped her from saying anything more. "Don't mistake this as forgiveness. You crossed lines I can't forget. But if this is what it takes to keep our family out of the news, I'll do it." Vanessa left, a faint hope in her eyes, and Blake felt a strange sense of closure. He had shown her mercy, not for her sake, but for his own integrity. He wouldn't let her drag him down to her level. He was free, and nothing would take that from him. The day of the trial came, and Blake testified on Vanessa's behalf, his words brief and neutral, sticking to the facts. The jury found Curtis guilty, and he was sentenced to prison. Vanessa was spared, but Blake could see that her life would never be the same. She had lost everything that mattered, and her image in the community was shattered. After the trial, Blake returned to his life, stronger and more certain than ever. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the stars, Marissa joined him, her presence a comforting warmth in the cool night air. "Thank you for everything, Blake," she whispered, leaning close. "I wouldn't have made it through without you." He looked at her, his heart full as he took her hand in his. "We made it through together, Marissa. And maybe, just maybe, this was all meant to be." They sat in silence, the weight of their pasts finally lifting, replaced by the promise of something new, something real. And in that moment, under the vast expanse of stars, Blake felt a peace he hadn't known in years. His life was far from perfect, but it was his, rebuilt from the ashes with someone who understood him better than he'd ever expected. And as he leaned in, pressing his lips softly to Marissa's, he knew he was ready to leave the past behind. For good.